First of all, let's put it into Premiere. So let's come into Premiere, and I'm going to make up a new timeline. Now my title was 1080, so I'm going to put it on a 1080 timeline. And now what I want to do is I want to get that title and shove it into the timeline here. You might notice I've got loads of different bins in my project, loads of different sequences and so on. And actually I made up a bin for the After Effects titles. So let's do that again. And I'm going to double click on it and just leave it there. And the easiest way to get the After Effects composition into Premiere is to see both of them. Click on the word project so I can see that there. And that's my composition. That's my After Effects composition. And I'm going to take that, drag it, and drop it into the Premiere bin. It's in Premiere, and I can take it, drag it, whack it onto the timeline. And I've got my After Effects comp sitting in Premiere. Try and play it back. Well, it's managing it. No, it's not managing it. It's struggling at the end there. But that's normal. It's an After Effects composition. Okay, well, there's a couple of things there that I need to sort out. First off, I haven't got my fancy blur. I forgot the fancy blur. I like the fancy blur. I think it makes it look cooler. Okay, let's come back into After Effects. So to turn on the fancy blur, what I've got to do is activate motion blur. Now you do that. Let's just put this back to the screen. You do that by turning on a couple of things here on the timeline. Now on the timeline here, you can see I've got all these different sort of blending modes and stuff. But if I click on the toggle swatches modes thing, it changes to a bunch of other things. And I need to get to this look to be able to enable motion blur. You know, earlier on when I actually chose screen here, it's vaguely possible if you tried to do that yourself, you couldn't see it. You've got to click on that to get to the word screen. Got lots of little different headings over here. If you hang over any of them long enough, it pops up with different things, telling you what they are, and that one is motion blur. So if I click on that and tick the little box, I get motion blur for all of the layers. Actually, I don't like motion blur on the lens flare, so I'm not going to leave that on. But I've turned motion blur on for everything else. So let's have a look at that. Simplest thing is to come in here, press the play button, and look at the brilliant... hang on, where is the motion blur? There is no motion blur. Might be because maybe I'm not seeing the full resolution. After Effects has this thing where it will adjust the resolution of the playback here. So whilst you're playing it, maybe you can see something. That's actually governed by this thing here. It says half. It's popped down to half resolution for some reason. Let's click on it and turn it off of auto and put it on full. So it means it's going to play full resolution all the time. Maybe that's why the motion blur is not showing up. I can tell you right now it isn't, but it's worth mentioning. Yep, that's not why the motion blur is showing up. The motion blur is not showing up because although I've turned it on for these layers, I haven't turned it on for the whole composition. See, there's a bunch of different switches here and there's some more switches along the top. And unless you click on these things, these don't have any effect. So like that one there will turn on motion blur for the whole composition. Just clicking it means that anything that's ticked down here should now have motion blur. So let's have a look at that. And you can say, yep, it's got a bit of motion blur. Struggled to play it back. It was stuttering there. You'll notice the second time I play it back, it managed it. And that's because After Effects basically renders it, just in the same way that Premiere would render it for you. After Effects renders it. But After Effects renders it if you play it. You might notice this little green bar here. It wasn't green a minute ago. Some of it isn't green. It goes green because it's rendered it. Unlike Premiere, Premiere will render it to the hard drive. After Effects renders it into the memory. And it renders it into the memory just by you pressing the play button and playing it. So once it's done it once, then it'll play it again. And you can see exactly what it's going to look like. And you can see there, yeah, well, I've got that coming in. It's quite nice. Actually, I want to crank the motion blur up a bit. Because although it's nice, it's not quite as nice as the one that I had before, which is more blurry. And I quite like to do that on titles. I like to crank the motion blur up a bit. Make sure I've got the composition selected. Go to Composition, Settings. And in here, go to the Advanced tab. And you see you've got this thing that says Shutter Angle here. If you up that number, you'll have more blur on the motion. And for titles, I think it looks quite cool to put it up quite a lot. And I'm putting it up to 720 degrees. You might notice immediately as soon as I change that number, the look changes here. I'm putting in 720 because I've used that a lot and it's a number I like. Now if I do that, you'll notice, okay, bit of a stutter to play it back in the first place, but having RAM previewed it, it'll now play it properly. Of course, it plays the first bit properly, doesn't play the last bit properly. I could do the same on the lens flares. Let's shove it on the lens flares and see what it looks like. Yeah, I'm not really seeing much difference on the lens flares. They're already pretty blurred in the first place, so probably doesn't make any difference there, so I'm turning it off. And I'll just leave it on the text. Right, let's save that. Pop back to Premiere. Go to the sequence that I put the title in, and oh, look at that. It worked. You also notice that Premiere actually played back the start of that pretty smoothly. Stuttered a bit at the end, but it played back the start of that. That's because if you have After Effects open at the same time and After Effects RAM previews it, and this line goes green, then Premiere will play it using After Effects RAM preview. You'll probably find when you come back to this later on, turn off the machine, come back to it, and you try and play it, it stutters. And that's because After Effects has no longer got the RAM preview. What I did to show you what this looked like in the first place is I rendered it in the standard Premiere way. I just marked an in and out point, pressed the enter key. Because unless it's rendered, it stutters. But if I happen to be playing in After Effects at the same time as Premiere, and After Effects has RAM previewed it, Premiere can use that RAM preview. So that's it. Right, I now think I've got everything sorted out. Let me grab hold of a bit of my actual sequences. I want that sequence to start exactly at 1 second in. So actually, the easiest way I found to do that is to select it and then actually just type in 100 and it moves it to exactly 1 second in. Wiped out the sound part of my After Effects title, but I don't care because I'm not using any sound in it. If I did care, I probably should have put it on a different track. I then wanted a 1 second cross dissolve at the start and the end of the video. Very easy. Control D. Now it should all work. I've got the title. I've got the video underneath it. Play it back, see what it looks like. And this is where we get to the other problem that I mentioned, which is basically the background's gone. I should be seeing the video underneath it, and I am not. Why is that? Actually, it's all down to the lens flares. And I mentioned that I would have a problem with this, and I mentioned when I switched it to screen so I could see everything underneath the lens flares that I would have a problem with it. This is the problem. If I turn off the lens flares, save this, pop back to Premiere, Premiere then gets updated so it matches what the After Effects composition is. You can see I do have a transparent background. The problem is the lens flares. After Effects compositions always start with a transparent background. There's a little cross-hatchy pattern there. If you click on that, you can see what parts of it are transparent. But as soon as you shove in some lens flares on a black thing like that, they disappear. But I want to keep the lens flares because I like the lens flares. So I'm actually going to find a different way of making that black. The screen isn't working. So I might as well turn it off screen because that didn't work. What I do is what's called a track matte. So I'm going to take that layer and then use that layer to cut a hole in itself. I do that by duplicating it and then going back to the original. And on these switches here, now if you can't see them, click this toggle switches thingy. But on these switches here, I go to this one, track matte. And I'm going to say use lens flare 2 as a matte, as a track matte. Now track matte is basically a black and white image. So the black bits go transparent and the white bits are opaque. So if I use that black and white image, I can actually use it to cut a hole in this layer. So I'm going to select that and I'm going to go to one of these two, Luma. You know, alpha is if it's got an alpha channel, if it's got a transparency channel, it'll use that, but I'm not doing that. I'm using one of these two, which is Luma. Don't know which one, but let's try it. One is just the luminance, one is the inverse of the luminance. Let's see which one works. Let's click on that one and that one worked. If I clicked on the other one, it goes the other way around. So yep, that's it. I've now cut a hole in it. I can see through it to the back. I can still see my lens flares traveling along nicely. So I'm quite happy with that. Let's save it, come back into Premiere, and now you can see I can see my background fading up. Now I had a bit of faffing around there to do with the lens flares, and that's because they were on a black solid. And you might say to yourself, David, there's a thing called adjustment layers in After Effects. They basically make transparent layers that you can stick stuff on. Why can't I use that? Well, why don't we try it? I'm going to turn off the two lens flare layers, right click and add in a new adjustment layer. And obviously you can size it and all the rest of it. And I'm going to take a lens flare and shove it on the top of that. And there you can see one of my problems I put the lens flare on the adjustment layer and I can't see it. If I move the lens flare center over the top of the video, you'll notice there you can see it, but the only bit you see it on is the bit where there is actually something. So on the transparent bits you don't see a thing. And that's the problem with the adjustment layers. They adjust the layers that are underneath them, but they'll only adjust the stuff that's there. If there's nothing there, they don't adjust it. So for a lens flare it doesn't work, because the lens flare only appears on the bit where there is something, not on the transparent thing. You can see back in Premiere, where I've done that, I get exactly the same thing. The lens flare's only appearing on the bit that I've made, it's not appearing on the background, which is why I have to do the other faff of doing a track matte.